notice the second angel's message. It's found in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. And another angel followed. Notice the sequence. We have to preach the second angel's message before we preach after we preach the first, never before. We can't reverse the order, in other words. It says in Revelation 14, verse 8, and another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city. Now, notice the expressions. Babylon is fallen, is fallen. When the Bible repeats something, it means that it is really fallen. When God repeats something, it's because it wants to intensify the expression. In other words, Babylon is really fallen, and you'll notice that Babylon is called that great city. Now, why did Babylon fall? Notice the last part of verse 8. It says, because, here's the reason why Babylon falls, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. In other words, Babylon has fallen, truly fallen, because Babylon gives wine to the inhabitants of the earth, and they become drunk with the wine of her fornication. In other words, we need to understand that the reason why Babylon falls is because she gives wine to the nations instead of accepting the first angel's message. You see, the reason why Babylon falls is because she rejected the first angel's message. The first angel's message has the truth of God. The wine of Babylon is the error of Babylon. In other words, they are opposites. The first angel's message is God's message. The wine of Babylon is the devil's message. And the reason why Babylon falls is because she gives her wine to the nations in contrast to the truths that we find revealed in the first angel's message. The prophecy of Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23, and became a harlot, and therefore the husband destroyed them. Of course, this could never happen to the Christian church. Do you think? It only could happen to Israel. It could never happen to the Christian church. You think? Let's go now and examine this concept with the New Testament church. New Testament Israel. Let me ask you, did Jesus marry his people when he came to this earth? Yes, he did. In a certain sense, he married them. He formed a covenant relationship with them. Notice Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 to 27. Ephesians 5, 25 to 27. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also what? Also loved the church and gave himself for her. So the relationship between husband and wife is used to illustrate the relationship between Jesus Christ and his what? Church. Jesus is the husband and his church is the what? Is the bride. Notice 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 2. 2 Corinthians 11 verse 2. Here it's explicit. The Apostle Paul says, speaking about the Corinthian church, for I am jealous for you with godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. Let me ask you, was the early church, the earliest church, a pure church? It was most certainly a pure church. Was it in a proper covenant relationship with Jesus Christ? You can read the book Acts of the Apostles, folks. It was a pure church. It was a conquering church, represented by the white horse, going out conquering and to conquer. It instilled terror in the hearts of sinners because of the righteousness and holiness of those who belong to the church. But then something happened. Apostasy came into the church. Notice 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. By the way, this is talking about the Antichrist, and we're going to deal with the Antichrist later in this series. We're going to talk about the beast. Notice 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4. It says, let no one deceive you by any means. For that day, that means the day of the coming of Jesus, that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. The expression falling away is one Greek word, and the word is apostasia, where we get our English word apostasy. In other words, Jesus will not come until the apostasy comes first. And the man of sin is revealed. What is sin? Remember this, transgression of the law. It's going to be a man who is going to say that it's okay to transgress the law of God. He's going to play games with the holy law of God. And it says, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Do you know the only other person in the Bible who's called the son of perdition? Judas Iscariot. Was Judas an outsider? Was Judas some pagan that warred against Jesus Christ from outside? No! He even betrayed Jesus with a kiss. In other words, the Antichrist is not going to arise from without. He's going to arise from where? From within the church, just like with Israel. And it says in verse 4, notice what this Antichrist is going to do, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God. Is he going to proclaim himself to be God? Absolutely. We're going to notice in the prophecy about the beast that he speaks blasphemies against God. And blasphemy is when an individual who is a mere man claims to be God. And so it says that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you know what the temple of God is? A lot of people today are looking to the Middle East. They say, oh, the Jewish temple has to be rebuilt. But every other place that the Apostle Paul uses that expression, temple of God, he's referring to the Christian church. For example, Ephesians 2, verses 19 to 21. He speaks of the Ephesians as being the temple of God. We read from 1 Corinthians chapter 6 where it says that we are the temple. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 says that the church of Corinth is the temple. In other words, the temple is not that temple in the Middle East, because Jesus says, your house is left unto you desolate. The temple is the church. So let me ask you, where was the apostasy going to arise? It was going to arise where? In the church. And the book of Revelation describes this end-time apostasy of the Christian church. I want you to notice Revelation chapter 17. We're going to see the characteristics here. You're going to now see some similarities with what we studied from Israel in the Old Testament. Revelation chapter 17, verse 1. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great what? Of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Oh, that great harlot must be Iraq. In the light of what we studied from the history of Israel, would this be some pagan nation, or would this be those who profess to be God's people? It must be those who profess to be God's people, because it speaks of a great harlot. And by the way, let me tell you something. I'm not going to identify who the great harlot is today. But by the characteristics, you're going to know who it is. And later on in this series, we are going to study a little bit more and identify what this power is. Now notice who this harlot is. Chapter 17 and verse 5 of Revelation. And on her forehead a name was written. Mystery. What is the name of this harlot? Mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. What is the name of this harlot? Her name is what? Her name is Mystery. Babylon the what? The Great. Does this have any relationship with the second angel's message? The second angel's message says, Babylon is fallen, that great city. Here, it says that this harlot's name is what? Babylon. By the way, we're told also in Revelation 17, verse 1, that she sits upon many waters. What does the act of sitting mean? The act of sitting means that she rules. Notice, chapter 17 and verse 1. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits, where? On many waters. Now, sitting on many waters would mean that she rules over the waters. But what do the waters represent? Notice Revelation 17 and verse 15. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 15. It says, then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Let me ask you, is she ruling basically globally? Yes. Revelation 13 says that the whole world wondered after the what? The beast, who is the same as the harlot, we're going to notice. And so we have to find a harlot church, because a harlot represents a fallen church, according to what we've studied. It has to be a church that is what? Global or worldwide, but there's more. It has to be a church that is involved with the nations, with the political nations of the world. Notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 2. Revelation chapter 17 verse 2. It's not only a church, it's not only a fallen church, it fornicates with the kings of the earth, just like Israel did. It says in Revelation 17 verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Let me ask you, does she fornicate with the kings of the earth just like Israel did? Absolutely. But I want you to notice that she also has daughters. Did we notice that about Israel? Notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5. Revelation 17 verse 5. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Do we have the word abominations here too? We have the word fornication. We have the word harlot. She controls the many waters of the world. Nations, multitudes, tongues, and peoples. Absolutely. And by the way, if she's a mother, she must have daughters, because I don't know the first mother that never had children. I know women who didn't have children. But mothers have children. And because she's a harlot, her daughters are also harlots. Now notice that she gives wine to the nations. Revelation 17 and verse 2. With whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. You'll just have to accept by faith what I'm going to say now. The wine represents her false teachings in contradiction to the first angel's message. She fell because she rejected the first angel's message. The wine is the opposite of the first angel's message. We're going to study that in our next lecture. In other words, she gives her false teachings and her false practices to the nations. And she makes them what? Drunk. That's why when you preach the truth, people don't want to accept it. It's almost impossible to give a Bible study to a drunk. Of course, we're speaking about spiritual drunkenness. We're not talking about literal drunkenness. I want you to notice how this harlot is dressed. Revelation 17 verse 4. Let me ask you, was Israel dressed with gold and with silver and her ornaments and everything? Yeah. Notice Revelation 17 verse 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. And adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of, here it is again, full of what? Abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. Is she decked with jewelry? She most certainly is. Does she want to impress her lovers with her riches and her looks? Absolutely. She's a global system. And everybody's impressed because of all of the riches and all of the wonderful, the gold and the silver that she has. And by the way, you notice that the colors that she majors in are purple and scarlet. Never blue. Because as we're going to notice in our next lecture, blue represents the law of God. And this system is contrary to God's holy law. Now, I want you to notice also that this woman is an assassin. You know, this woman has killed God's people. Did we find that of Israel in the Old Testament? We most certainly did. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. Now I want to show you something which is very important for what we're going to study in the future. This harlot is only one part of Babylon. She's the main protagonist of Babylon. But Babylon in Revelation is composed of three parts. Are you understanding what I'm saying? She is, for example, like Jezebel. You know, Jezebel was the key figure. She manipulated everything, and her false prophets did what she said, and the king, King Ahab, did what she said. But she was the main power behind the king and behind the false prophets.